Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. A few hours ago I put up a video, Alec Baldwin files to dismiss. Well, in this video we're going to examine whether Mamie Mitchell, the script supervisor on Rust, whether she has a case. Alec Baldwin's response to the Mitchell suit is a lack of intent. I think it's a myth that intent is difficult to prove, and I also think the intent that needs to be asserted here is twofold. The possibility of a generalized malaise covering the whole production, which is an aspect that Mamie Mitchell's suit certainly addresses, and then also the possibility that if there were lax standards and other lapses, and these can be proven, that these leaked into the events of October 21st as well as the incident itself. In Mitchell's 30-page affidavit, I was a little surprised that the legal narrative wasn't more detailed, more descriptive, or, compelling. I was surprised it wasn't better written, given that this comes from the script supervisor. I do think Mitchell's lawyers summarizing the merits during a press conference on the 17th was fairly convincing in certain respects. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment. If you want to join the discussion of this case on Patreon, head on to patreon.com/TCRS. And let's get started.
The assistant director made an alleged statement to Mr. Baldwin that the gun he was handing to Mr. Baldwin was a, quote, cold gun, end quote. Mr. Baldwin should not have relied on such a statement. 4, the industry norm is that the armorer hands the gun to the actor and demonstrates to the actor, in this case Mr. Baldwin, that the gun chamber is empty. Mr. Baldwin knew that this was the norm and that it was not followed, and he did not check the gun himself. Further, the industry norm and safety bulletin requires that no one shall be issued a firearm until he or she is trained in safe handling, safe use, the safety lock, and proper firing procedures. Mr. Baldwin knew, or should have known, that this was the safety protocol and chose to ignore it. 5, all guns and ammunition are supposed to be secured throughout the production. The armorer is required to keep all guns and ammunition locked up or to stay with the guns until they are used. Instead, the armorer is alleged to have allowed guns and ammunition to be left unattended on a rolling cart outside the church at midday on Thursday during the lunch break.
In terms of the merits of the suit itself, we pick up the narrative on page 13 at point 33, dealing with a section titled The Tragic Incident. It reads, "This case arises out of October 21st, 2021, the deadly discharge of a loaded gun by defendant Baldwin that occurred on the set of the Western-themed motion picture Rust, a film project that would necessitate the use of numerous weapons used by the filming crew throughout Rust's anticipated 21-day shoot." And so I think what stands out at the outset is that numerous weapons would be used on this motion picture and the short turnaround of just 21 days. In addition to that, you could say, due to the number of weapons being used and the short turnaround, wouldn't you have needed an experienced armorer? You couldn't just have any armorer, you'd need someone who knew what he or she was doing. Point number 34. At the time, the plaintiff, that is Mamie Mitchell, was standing less than 4 feet away from Baldwin when he aimed the gun in the direction of Mamie Mitchell and subsequently discharged it at her without warning and without necessary and required safety precautions in place. At the moment of discharge, Mamie Mitchell was standing right next to Helena, who was fatally shot as a result of the discharged gun. If point number 34 is accurate, then Mitchell was standing even closer to Alec Baldwin than Serge was. If Serge was slightly behind Elena, it sounds like Mitchell was standing right beside her. A major difference seems to be that Mitchell was looking at her phone when the incident happened, which seems to be the reason this version is in some ways less detailed than the gaffer's, certainly in terms of the events inside the church. Point 35. This tragic incident has caused and continues to cause Mamie Mitchell to suffer compensable damages, including etc., etc. As a result, the plaintiff was severely injured, her health, strength, activity, etc. And there's also talk about extreme nervous pain and suffering. Although there's no doubt that this had to be a shocking and traumatic experience, not even the director has sued Baldwin for either severe injury or emotional distress. I'll leave it to you to decide what you think of the assertion that Mamie Mitchell sustained serious physical trauma as well as injury to her nervous system. Point 36. When Mamie Mitchell accepted the opportunity to work on the filming for the production, she was excited to be back on a movie set following a long absence due to the pandemic. 37. At the time Mamie Mitchell accepted the script supervisor position, she had worked in the entertainment business for about 4 decades. Her resume includes around 100 different productions. In terms of point 36, what impact did the pandemic have on making certain crew members rusty in certain areas? They hadn't been working for a while, perhaps a little impatient and or hasty to get going, given how long they'd been sort of sitting around. For some people, I think they'd been unemployed. We know that one of the consequences of the pandemic was that crew were in short supply at the time, certainly of this production, and specifically the role of the armorer. It seems that the pandemic had a direct impact on particularly this area. Point 37. It sounds like Mamie Mitchell understands the regulations and protocols, given that she's so experienced, given that she's worked on around 100 productions. It would be interesting to know what some of them were. Point number 38. Thursday, October 21st, 2021, the day of the tragic incident, was the 12th day of the 21-day shoot in the Bonanza Creek Ranch near Santa Fe, New Mexico. The 12th day was essentially going to be just past the halfway mark. If you take the 11th day as halfway, the 12th day, had it concluded, would have taken them beyond the halfway mark. Well, I suppose you could say day 11 did that. But in any event, they didn't get beyond really day 11. They completed day 11, never got beyond halfway through day 12. The plaintiff, this is fact number 39, or point number 39, the plaintiff informed and believes that the first 11 days of the production were filled with a variety of safety issues that placed the defendants, including the producers and others in control of the production, on notice that there were serious safety-related problems on the set that were endangering the cast and crew. And this was related to the use of firearms. According to Mamie Mitchell, she says that guns had been misfired on the set on prior occasions. And then there's a reference to things we already know, the stunt double and the prop master accidentally shooting herself in the foot. That says it all, doesn't it? That the first 11 days of shooting were filled with a variety of accidents. And so if the first 11 days of shooting were filled with accidents, why wouldn't the last 11 days also be? Point 41. On October 21, 2021, the day of the tragic accident, Mamie Mitchell arrived on set at about 6:30. That also sounds right. The first scenes that were filmed that morning before lunch were in the small church and included Alec Baldwin's character playing an injured Harland Rust and a young boy. And I think that's quite important to emphasize, is within the context of the film, the scene they were shooting was of Alec Baldwin being injured. And so what do injured people do when they're backed into a corner and when they've got a weapon in their hands? We haven't heard much from this young boy either, have we? It's also interesting that Baldwin's character sort of plays a hero granddad figure to a small child. Well, not a small child, I think it's a teenager. One wonders whether Baldwin didn't do this or think of this in terms of this project of his with his own family in mind. Point 42. When the morning filming was completed, everyone broke for lunch. At that time, the plaintiff, that's Mamie Mitchell, Helena, and Joel, met and spoke together in order to confirm what filming would take place after the lunch break. It was discussed that there would be 3 tight camera shots when filming resumed. One camera shot would be focused on Alec Baldwin's eyes, one would be focused on the blood stain on Baldwin's shoulder, and the third would focus on Baldwin's torso as he reached his hand down to his holster and removed the gun. There was nothing in the script about the gun being discharged by Alec Baldwin or by any other person. From this description, there's absolutely no mention of the weapon itself being the focus of any camera shots. Does that make sense? I mean, in the interview he did on ABC, he was talking about how important it was to hold the gun at this angle and whatever, as if the gun was going to be the focal point. But was it? Wasn't his torso the focal point? And the gun was sort of, although in the foreground, kind of in the background. Point 43. The defendant, that is Alec Baldwin, discharged the gun inside the church. There was nothing in the script indicating that. 44. If there was to have been any firearm discharged in the upcoming scene, along with a number of other crew members, would have had to be situated outside of the church. This is Mamie Mitchell and these other crew members would have had to have been outside the church when this occurred. There was no such indication in the script. And I think there were script revisions discussed during lunch, which it's interesting that this isn't mentioned in this affidavit or this complaint. The fact that apparently the assistant director and the script supervisor spoke of script revisions. What was that about? The script called for a firearm, had the script called for the firearm to be discharged, Mamie Mitchell, along with a number of other crew members, would have been required to view the discharging of the gun via exterior monitors that would have been set up outside the church. Now, this is where it gets quite interesting. If that was the case, that they wanted to discharge the gun, well, because 6 crew members had walked off that day, they didn't have those exterior monitors available. So was something being done kind of off the books unofficially or not? Just an interesting question. So I think it's interesting if you consider the discharging of the gun as part of the plot or the script. Had it been, even stricter protocols would have been in place. So if Mamie Mitchell is accurate, who elected to go beyond the script and why? Now we go into 46. Immediately prior to Alec Baldwin unexpectedly discharging the loaded gun, the cinematographer Helena and Joel Souza and Baldwin and Mamie Mitchell were in very close proximity with one another inside the church for the afternoon scene. Alec Baldwin, it says here, was sitting in a pew wearing a holster with a gun that had been handed to him earlier by defendant Halls. So there doesn't seem to be any dispute that it was Halls, the assistant director, that handed the gun to Baldwin. And from what we know, it should actually be the armorer who does that. The armorer should be the last person to give the weapon to the actor. Do I understand that correctly? Anyway, several other crew members were also inside the church, including the wardrobe person, a camera operator, and a gaffer. At that time, and this is just repeated, Mamie Mitchell was less than 4 feet from where Baldwin was seated, and she had Hutchins on her left and Joel Souza behind Hutchins. Halls has already admitted that he didn't do a thorough enough check of the weapon. I think he said he checked 3 rounds instead of all 6 of them. In theory, you have a scenario of 3 potential failures. The armorer not checking, the assistant director not checking, and the lead actor not checking. Consider this. If any one of the three had done a proper check, couldn't the outcome have been different? Point 48. Shortly before Alec Baldwin fired the gun, Mamie Mitchell was looking both at a picture of Alec Baldwin on her phone and at Alec Baldwin in front of her, including while he was moving the loaded gun within approximately 4 feet in front of her, and she was checking for continuity in terms of the upcoming afternoon scenes, and goes on to mention a couple of things there. Technically then, Mamie Mitchell was looking at her phone when the incident occurred. She was in the church, but looking at her phone. 49. Suddenly and without warning, Mamie Mitchell heard and felt a shocking and deafening sound from the gunshot. It was unlike anything she had ever heard in her life. Mamie Mitchell was terrified and feared for her life. The gunshot caused Mamie Mitchell to experience pain in her ears and head, and shortly thereafter she heard a loud ringing in her ears. This part corresponds with Serge's version of events. Now point 50. Soon after, Mamie Mitchell witnessed the horror of what had happened. She heard what sounded like moaning, and as she turned toward the moaning sound, she saw Joel Souza doubled over. Then she understood, this is pertinent in point number 50, the plaintiff understood that he had been shot. She knew immediately then, when she saw him, that he'd been shot. Mamie Mitchell then turned her head and saw Helena on the ground, not moving. It was then that she knew that both Hutchins and Souza had been shot by the gun that Alec Baldwin had taken out of the holster, pointed in their direction and discharged. So it's quite immediate. She also knows immediately what has happened. And she reacts on it because she goes out the church, after that point and calls 911. Now remember, Baldwin described Souza as screaming. From this description, it also appears that when Helena dropped to the ground, she was already severely wounded, so much so that while conscious, she could barely move. One's heart really goes out to her, when you think about what happened in all of these scenarios. And so we go on to the 53rd point, and that is below this aspect of the low-budget filming of rust and related cost-cutting measures intentionally and without just cause endangered the lives of crew members, including of the plaintiff. So I'm not going to go through point 53, but it just identifies the various people and entities that she's sort of accusing. But the question is, did the low-budget status of the film also imbue it with a particular attitude or culture on set? I think the real question is whether this attitude or culture was normal for a low-budget film or whether it was beyond normal. In other words, were certain habits and behaviors habitually abnormal? And if so, how so? Point 55. Mamie Mitchell believes that the cost-cutting practices, including failure to follow basic standard safety protocols and practices, forcing production crews to adhere to rushed and unreasonable production schedules, and hiring crew members and other staff that often lacked the knowledge, expertise, and experience to adequately ensure their safety and the safety of others. So they're saying that this led to failures. So, for example, you might say rushing on a low-budget film is normal. The question is, was the rushing on this film abnormal? Was it abnormally rushed? Was it abnormal to the point that the rushing led to safety issues? 57. There's a mention of the producers intending to cut through what is considered derisively as red tape that's common in Hollywood-based productions. So I've got a question. Aren't a lot of cowboy movies shot in California? It would be good to know the specifics around who among the producers was derisive about red tape and what was precisely said on this topic. 58. It goes on to say that the defendant producers intentionally failed to hire experienced crew members to manage and handle the numerous weapons that were to be used in the film Rust, an outlaw Western-themed film that was known to involve the use of numerous firearms, considered an ultra-hazardous activity, throughout its filming. So this is a tricky one. I don't know if the producers intentionally failed to hire experienced crew members. What we do know is they intentionally decided to combine the armorer's role, which was why more experienced crew that were approached didn't take the job. And so the point goes on to state that someone was intentionally hired by the defendant, and that's a reference to Hannah Gutierrez Reed. She was intentionally hired. Hannah was intentionally hired, but does this have any relevance to intent? I'd say the hiring of Hannah was more a failure and a concession, perhaps one of many, than a deliberate act. Point number 61. The producers knew about the unreasonably safe and dangerous context in which they were placing Rust crew members during the filming of Rust, due to previous implementation of cost-cutting filmmaking measures in other projects and due to at least 2 instances of weapons misfiring. This is the critical question. Did they know about the unsafe set? Were they informed? Were they reasonably expected to be informed? Jumping ahead to point 64, the plaintiff is informed and believes that the defendants allowed live ammunition on the production of Rust. So Mamie Mitchell makes quite an on-the-chin allegation here that live ammunition was allowed on the movie set. If you say that by hiring an inexperienced armorer through that course of actions, live ammunition was allowed on the set, that's different to expressly allowing it. For example, if plinking was frequently taking place and everyone knew about it, then one can suggest how live ammunition got on set was that it was simply allowed on set. But was it? I can't see any express references to plinking in Mitchell's affidavit, nor in any of the others. If this aspect is true and if it can be proved, that could more easily decide the outcome of this case. In conclusion, I want to quote this comment from someone called Laurie, one of the patrons on Patreon. She makes the following comment, quote, "While Baldwin appeared confident that he would not face criminal charges in his interview with ABC, the Santa Fe District Attorney did not rule out this possibility. The day after Baldwin's interview, the DA responded, 'There is no evidence that the shooting was intentional. This was clearly an accident, but perhaps a criminal accident. Just because something is an accident doesn't mean that a criminal act didn't occur.' She also commented on the production's overall problematic culture, saying, 'There were so many levels of failures on that set.' I think you can compare it to driving a car with dodgy brakes or dodgy lights. If you're in 1 or 2 harmless crashes and you still don't fix the car, then when there is a fatality, you can't call it an accident. You can't call it accidental, and you can't blame the car. You blame whoever was behind the wheel, but nevertheless never took charge properly of the situation. Does that make sense? So I'm not going to take it further than that. I am going to be talking a little bit more about intent. Is intent very difficult to prove in the legal sense? And then also I want to talk about the supplemental reports made by the officers on the scene. That's also quite interesting. And then separate to that, for those interested in Vincent van Gogh, I'm going to be doing a live tomorrow, probably around about 4 or 5 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. And I'm going to be beginning a series debunking or trying to debunk the book by an art expert on Van Gogh's finale, where he talks about what actually happened in the last days of Van Gogh's life. People don't think that the Van Gogh story is a true crime story, but the police were involved, and it, to some extent, is also an unsolved mystery. I've written a book about it, and I'm going to be dealing with this art expert's insights in a kind of informed way, and some of you might find it really interesting, so look out for that tomorrow. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.